Before we even get into the text, which we will do in the worship service, this idea of my hope. When you think of the word hope, what comes to mind? I mean, we're all wearing, well, not all of us, but many of us are wearing jerseys of some kind, of different teams, different players perhaps. Your hope is perhaps that your team is going to do well. My twins clinched their playoff spot here a night or two ago. I know we're a little after the fact of some teams, but so I figured it would be appropriate to wear my twins' uniform, even though most of you, if not all of you who are wearing outfits, are wearing some kind of football jersey. But hope in that sense is fleeting, isn't it not? That this year our hope on our team doing well could be strong, while next year it could be a total flop, right? So if we're now looking in a more of a Christian sense, scriptural sense, what is our hope that is built on nothing less referring to? Yes, ma'am. Christ. Yes, ma'am. So our hope is built on Christ, right? And so when life happens and we look for Christ, our hope is perhaps restored, or strengthened, or confirmed, or other such words. Right? And so as you'll sing the words that later in the service, you'll see exactly why hope in Christ is your thing and how you're going to be able to use it. All right, we have some of the what's my word? Well, you have that information. So you have your authors, you have your copyrights, it's in the public domain. The melody of key of C, topics, justification, and trust. So will lead us on. And perhaps a reason why we might have been able to, or we picked this hymn for today is because it is number one, based upon our gospel text. But it's also, when we take a look at our gospel text here from Matthew chapter 20, we're going to see how life is unfair. And so when life is unfair, we're able to look to Christ. Almost sounds like a VBS theme, doesn't it? When life is unfair, look to Jesus. So let's get into Matthew then. It's a parable that you're probably all fairly familiar with, the laborers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now, we've heard quite a few different stories about a vineyard. That seems to be a favorite, object lesson, if you will, for Jesus to use. If we back up a few verses into Matthew chapter 19, the disciples are again going to have a conversation with Jesus about how do we get to heaven. And this is going to be how Jesus answers them. So the kingdom of heaven is like a master who hires laborers for his vineyard. All right? And many times, if not each time, that we take a look at a parable, we're going to see how the vineyard is representing life, right? Or the world. The workers being us, and the master of the house being God himself. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. Now, I got to be honest with you, when I see a denarius a day, that doesn't really mean all that much to us, right? I mean, we can go through the dictionary and the whatever commentary books to find out exactly how much a denarius is, but this whole idea that it starts with the indefinite article a denarius. singular. And in our inflated, bloated world, we're thinking that's probably not very much, right? And in our world, are we not used to the idea of we work, maybe 8 o'clock till 4:30, 5 o'clock? And we probably have breaks in there for lunch and so forth. And then we get to go home, right? Unless you have a job that requires you to, in a sense, take work home with you. Almost like school, you got to take home your homework, right? But if we go back to, and I don't know, biblical times, if you want to refer to it as that, a normal work day is going to be basically sun up to sundown. And you get paid for that day versus per hour. So getting paid a denarius a day is perhaps being written in the language of that biblical time. So we could perhaps, sometimes we see this translated as a day's wage, right? In other parables that you have seen or context and so forth. So that sounds like a normal business contract, right? That master hires his workers, their denarius a day, they agree to it, everything's good to go, right? Workers go off and do their work. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." Again, nothing too heavy to give us heartburn about. It just sounds very normal, doesn't it? Or would you disagree with that thought? Okay? And he said, and to them he said, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you." So they went. Going out again, so they agreed with him, so they go. Going out again about the 6th hour, so a couple hours later, and the 9th hour, he did the same. Again, does it not sound pretty simple, pretty easy? About the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, so we get a little bit more conversation now, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." I mean, don't we all know personalities that they almost need some kind of invitation to get them to do anything? Maybe some of us are that way. I know I generally prefer people to come to me and say, "Hey, Mark, why don't you?" Many times, though, we take the initiative and do it without being asked, right? But so you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages." Okay? So far, so good, right? Beginning with the last up to the first. Now we're starting to get into an area where things may be a little bit unusual. Because, just evaluate that clause for a little bit. Beginning with the last up to the first. If you were one of these laborers in the story, and you started right away in the morning, one of the very first ones, and then you saw that the ones hired at the end got paid first, what would your line of thinking be? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. So far, up to this point in the text, everybody is still, happy in a sense. They get to this phrase, and maybe they're starting to think, wait a minute, that doesn't sound fair. Maybe they're not really sure why that doesn't sound fair yet, but they're starting to get there, I would think anyway. And we get a little bit further, Jeannie's thoughts here are going to come into play. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. All right, so I would imagine that those first hired are really starting to, wait a minute. What's going on here? That's what the master of the house agreed to pay me. So maybe, does that start one's mind thinking, well, does that mean that I'm going to actually get maybe 2 denarius or 3? Hey, maybe somehow I got a raise and I didn't even know it. I didn't even ask for it. Now, when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. So we've reached that point where they are now going to be able to vocalize their thoughts of unfairness, thoughts of, hey, I worked the whole day. They worked part of the day. Why are they getting paid as much as I'm getting paid? Ever been in that scenario? Maybe not necessarily in the concept of what our text is saying, but maybe you remember a school day conversation, argument. Maybe you remember arguing with your parents about something or with one of your siblings. If we thought about it long enough, we probably could all come up with a thought or two on that, huh? And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." So perhaps it gives us some details on why they might be thinking this. That number one, we should get paid more. Number two, our work was harder than their work. So we should get paid more because we did harder work. Isn't that the thought that we as human beings might think? That when we're thinking in the ways of man? Because if we're on this first level of reading here, would this happen in life? Now, when we think about God's ways, which is obviously different, now we start going, what's going on here? Our Old Testament reading from Isaiah is going to really kind of put the exclamation point on this and say that God's ways are not our ways. Well, obviously, because if God's ways were our ways, then this text would be written a whole lot differently, wouldn't it? You don't think so?
This is what happens at work all the time, right? I mean, people's salaries wind up being very commensurate, right? You wind up with what people do for the work. It might not be by the hour, but it's still.
And how many of your fellow employees, if only to themselves, decry that's not fair?
Oh yeah, but all of them. But my point is, it was pointed out to me to start reading the Bible not necessarily as God talking about himself or as Jesus talking about the nature of God, but as explaining the nature of reality and how things are. So this is how things are. So it's not God is unfair. God is
Yeah.
rather than I'm coming down on you because you displeased me.
Yeah.
It has a different feeling.
So when you see how God is responding to our actions, of how he's constantly coming after us, in Adam and Eve's case, I've often hear that phrase that parent is a verb. Sometimes you have to give the child a consequence for what they did. It's no fun for anybody involved. So is God a verb as well? When I was at the seminary, Dr. Kolb loved the phrase that God did God to God. So God the noun did God the verb to God the direct object, and so forth. That instead of doing God to us, doing all that righteous judgment and so forth to us, he does it all to himself. So that, which also is highly unfair in the context of the scriptures, that God would sacrifice himself so that we would reap benefits, the benefits of heaven, the benefits of his righteousness. So while, again, on the first reading of this, of reading the context of, seems like a normal work day, and the laborers seeing that the master, the boss, is doing things differently. And if this is, now when we jump into that second reading and see God's reality instead of our reality, then yeah, this is the way it's supposed to be done. But in our sinfulness, we don't always see that, do we? We don't see how God leaves the 99 to come after the one, to come after us. All right, so now this next clause, it's going to have, I think, an interesting thought for us to take a look at. But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong." Now this idea that he calls him friend. Earlier, he was referred to as a worker or a laborer, but now he is friend. Take that into that second level of reading, of now we're not looking at the context of a workday per se, but now we're looking at the context of that heavenly meaning of how God so desires to have that relationship with you, that God comes to you, and we're now looking at more that heavenly side of things, or maybe a helpful word here would be that spiritual side of things, that before the Lord calls to us and sends us into the vineyard to work, that we would be that worker, that laborer, that non-Christian. Then when he, and granted, we're using the verbiage and the language of working, which a lot of times doesn't necessarily agree with our Lutheran theology, perhaps, or maybe not disagree with, but we have other words and analogies that we like to use better, and so forth, which we'll get to in a moment. But the idea of coming to the Lord through the washing of baptism, we are now no longer just slaves and servants, but rather we are sons and daughters. We are God's friend. So if you even just take a look at the differences between friend and, enemy, if you want to use that as the opposite word of friend, to be a friend of God versus to be an enemy of God. And then you can, in your mind, kind of go through that thought process of what does that mean? That I'm a friend of God, and if the big guy is on my side, my friend, it means he's going to take care of me, right? In all the different ways. But if God's on the other side, I've got to be nervous. I've got to be worried. Yes, sir.
Beyond that, we are here children.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, talking to my wife yesterday about how blessed we are to be under his care. We are deeply cared for by
Mm-hmm.
the Lord. Not only, of course, our sins are forgiven, but he cares deeply.
Sure. Indeed. Exactly. The idea that if God's our friend, he is caring for us. He is watching out for us. He is leaving heaven to come after us, come to search for us, and so forth. Now, again, this idea of a wage, perhaps when we think of that word, reminds us of what Paul writes to the Romans, that the wages of sin is death. But then that next part of that verse is perhaps a word that maybe we would gravitate a little bit more to. It says, but the free gift of God. And so, I mean, if you talk about a wage, it maybe puts in your mind the thought of having to do something to receive it. Now, our sinfulness says that because I'm sinful, I'm going to get, or my wage is going to be death. Perhaps, if we went back and reread this, instead of the word wage, but rather gift, maybe that would put a different thought in our minds. Ultimately, it's saying the same thing. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Sure. Indeed. Yeah. Right. Indeed. Sure. Right. Outside of. Right? Well, that just means you're listening. After Marcia kind of did this, right? Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Salvation, okay? So instead of, yeah, sure. So instead of paying a denarius a day, get paid salvation. I'm right there with you, sir. Resentment? Okay.
And honestly, especially in church, we read that and we picture ourselves as the guy who started working early in the day, but how often are we the last guy hired?
Yeah.
And understanding that, yeah, there's a lot of grace, like we talked about earlier. Everybody feels like they're the one who's underpaid.
Yeah.
Everybody else is overpaid.
That right?
So that's not what it's about.
Yeah. And I think that is perhaps one of the more classic responses to this, that, especially in a more of a one-on-one counseling session, you hear it all the time that people will say, so you're meaning to tell me that I've been a Christian all my life, and this last guy, he's been a Christian for, half an hour before he dies, and he going to get the same reward as I am, who's been a Christian for 80-some years? Yep, that's exactly what the Scripture's saying. That to us it's not fair, but we're not using our reality, to use your word. We're not using our ways. We're using God's ways and God's reality to try to understand this.
I guess part of my point is the reality is that it's both. There is advantage, like there is an advantage to working hard. It sucks, but there's satisfaction, and that needs to be spiritually,
Yeah.
honestly, is
Yeah.
working hard. So being a Christian your whole life should be helping your life also.
Yeah.
Because it's not just all building up in heaven.
Yeah.
If you do it right, it should make everything work better.
Well, and you can see how God's working in your life all the time. That I'm a firm believer that you can use the cross and resurrection, Easter itself, in every situation, whether it's a situation of depression, grief, unfairness, of whatever you want to pick on. That is the central and key point to understand how not only is what you're going through important to God, but how God's going to use that to strengthen you and get you through that rough spot in life.
If you're oriented appropriately how God has
Yeah.
the Bible, your reality will be better.
Yeah.
Regardless of what.
So God is with us here and now, in addition to the not yet to come. Did I see your hand up?
I was just thinking how Saul persecuted, killed people in the church, and then he came around, the Lord came to him and saved him. And a lot of people were really upset with him being an apostle.
Yeah.
Preaching the gospel. And that might be a real life kind of example of this parable.
That's a perfect example of how many people, the disciples included, who were just downright shaking in their boots at the mention of Saul. That they would have to go to Saul, now named Paul, and minister the gospel. And in our way of life, when we are doing, here in 2023, I'm sure we each know somebody out there who is intimidating, who is, oh, there's that person, I'm going this way. I don't want to talk to them, type of thing. But yet God calls us to go and talk to them about Jesus. That maybe they already know Jesus, but by you talking to them, they get to know him just a little bit better. And then how much of the New Testament does Paul spend, in a sense, saying, yeah, I used to do this, this, and this. But the key and central point of why I'm different now is not because of what I'm doing or what I've said or whatever, but because Jesus came and introduced himself to me, and called me by name, and made me part of his family. So it's not based upon who I am that I am different now, but it's based upon Christ and what he has done for us. And so each one of us has that moment in our lives. We call it baptism. That before our baptism, and granted, probably for most of us, I'm guessing, we were this big when we were baptized. and probably a fair number of us, we were more this big when we were baptized and came to faith. That before that baptism, we didn't know Jesus. And now after baptism, we know Jesus. And that is why we are different. That is why we are able to proclaim Jesus' name and say, yes, I am a sinner, but because of Jesus, I am forgiven. And now I'd like to tell that story to you in mission, outreach, evangelism. All right, so the master is replying to them, type of conversation here. He says, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? So maybe the master is going to that very first level of conversation here. Hey, buddy, we agreed for denarius. So what are you complaining about? You're getting what we agreed to. I'm holding my end of the deal here. You held your end of the deal by working the day for me, by working the shift. Here's your denarius. Be happy and be satisfied, right? Now, if we take this to the second level of reading, and we insert words like salvation and gift and so forth, we're able to now bring in that conversation with somebody who says, hey, I've been a Christian all my life. They've been a Christian for half an hour. I should be getting more. I should go to the 5th level of heaven while they only go to the 1st level of heaven, type of thing, right? That's a whole nother Bible study on levels of heaven that we might not be able to answer until we actually get to heaven of what that means. But take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Now, back at this clause, beginning with the last up to the first, the master could have avoided all of this by paying the first, right? Then they would have been gone by the time he would have been paying the last. Or there's a good possibility he'd been gone. So maybe that was a red flag as well for us, going, Jesus is about to turn the tables on us here a little bit. Was Jesus using this to maybe start to teach this lesson? That to catch people, make them start thinking about this. What do you think? Yes? No? Maybe so? All right, so am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Right? If you're the employee, are you going to say to the employer, you can't do that? Why not? It's my money, my business. If I want to run it this way, I get to run it this way, right? And wouldn't that be, to follow the logic of this conversation, wouldn't that make sense? Or do you begrudge my generosity? Now, this word begrudge, if you look into the Greek, we can actually get a little bit stronger of a thought process here, where is your eye evil toward my generosity? Is your eye evil towards my generosity? Or in English, the ESV is using the word begrudge. Could this scenario, again on that first level of reading, could this lead to the employee resenting the employer? Do any of us ever resent God? Even as, let's be generous for the day and call ourselves strong Christians, strong sinful Christians, right? Have you ever been mad at God? Resentful? God, that's not fair. God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? I'm a good person. And other such phrases. So the last will be first and the first last. And in that sentence, I mean, that's just a sentence. But in my mind, that shoots me straight to the cross. With Jesus being the ultimate first, going to the last position. Jesus didn't have to leave heaven. He had it perfect. He had it glorious. He had it, all the words that we might use to describe heaven and righteous and so forth. Except for that little thing that he liked to call love. Love that he has for us. John 3:16 we talked about in confirmation classes last week. How many times have you used that verse in your way of life? Because of that love that he tells us in John 3:16, Jesus was willing to give up his firstness, I'm going to make up some words here, and be last. So, this idea of Jesus being last so that you could be first, I would say is a great feeling. It strengthens us, it empowers us, how would you like to look at it? Got any thoughts, any words? Well, I would encourage you to use that thought this next week in your personal devotional lives. How has, besides the idea of Easter itself, how else has Jesus come after you? Giving up heaven itself so that he could find you personally and individually. How has Jesus given up heaven so that he could do life with you? That he could sit with you as your family member goes through cancer. So that he could walk with you as your job lays you off, as your contract comes to an end, as my twins beat your players. I had to throw in a corny joke. But the fact that you somewhat chuckled tells me that my joke somewhat worked. All right. So take this phrase, so the last will be first and the first last. You've heard it many places. Use it for your devotions this week. Any last questions, thoughts, comments? All right. Let us close with prayer then. Our Father, who art in heaven. All right, thanks for coming today.